to a lab and done something to it, and you can persuade the patent office and the courts of the United States under current law that you have modified it or changed it or done something with it that constitutes a patentable innovation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. That's what we're getting to here. That kind of story is exactly the kind of thing that Kloppenberg is. I mean, he wrote the book before the golden rice came along, but the story he's telling is exactly the story of the sort of legal and economic backdrop in which such innovations have been introduced more recently. And we should talk about that a little bit later. Right. Right. New technologies have enabled, in this case, the development of a kind of rice with a heightened concentration of some other nutrient, which is it? Vitamin A. And that innovation of splicing vitamin A into rice is patentable. And golden rice, I believe it is actually golden in color, is a private commodity that if you want to plant it, you have to buy the seed from the company that owns the patent, and you can't just then take the seeds from that rice and plant it again, as would have been the case with an unpatented seed, right? These kinds of contract relations associated with genetic engineering are the kind of endpoint of Kloppenberg's story. Any other questions? Yeah.
So once with golden rice, the seeds and everything are golden, all the seeds that go golden are equivalent to what they
In some cases, yes. In some cases, the trait that is spliced into the seed is heritable and passes on to the next generation of seeds. In other cases, they figured out ways to prevent that from being the case, right? And in many ways, hybrid corn is the kind of prototype around which this evolves, which is to say, here's a seed that is extremely productive in the first generation, but the subsequent generations aren't. And that's a different thing from the kind of gene splicing that we're talking about with golden rice. But Kloppenberg's point is that this sort of sets the framework for property relations in seed in the United States in relation to scientific research, agricultural research, right? And that it's precisely when you've got that kind of ability to control the subsequent generations that you can potentially make a great deal of money from it, and it becomes the object of corporate interest. There's another question, yeah?
Isn't it also a major concern for storing seed that you're not exposing seeds to like environmental conditions, like changing environmental conditions, and say you store them in a lab for using then CO2 exchange, temperature exchange, and by the time you release them, the environment's changed so much that they're useless.
That's certainly a concern in theory. I mean, yes, some seeds can last a long time if you store them properly. Other seeds not as long. And certainly you can't just assume that the seed that you banked 50 years ago is going to come out into the world today and do everything that it would have done 50 years ago, because the world will have changed in between. So Kloppenberg works from this discussion into a more specific and detailed contradiction that is entrained by this. And that has to do with genetic erosion. He says the utility of plant genetic resources lies in their variability. And this variability applies or manifests itself at all different scales. And this is an extremely important point. There is variability, and you might hear variability contained within that is diversity. Okay? And in some respects, they're two terms for a very similar thing. It exists in the organisms themselves, in the genetic makeup of the plant seed itself, in terms of the diversity of the genes themselves. Heterozygosity versus homozygosity. Heterozygosity means a great deal of diversity at the genetic scale, or at the scale of the genetic makeup of the seeds, versus homozygosity. Here, perhaps again we can revert to the dog breeding example. What we're concerned with here, in many ways, is a measurement of how similar the next generation is likely to be of any given organism's DNA. If you breed two Dalmatians to each other, chances are that the offspring will be Dalmatians every single time. The heterozygosity has been bred out of Dalmatians, whereas if you take two mutts from the pound and breed them, chances are good that the offspring, the puppies in that litter, will not all look alike, right? Maybe two or three of them will look alike and the others won't at all, or maybe they'll all look very different. The heterozygosity of those two dogs is still high, which means that the offspring are sort of unpredictable. And this is true of plants as well. We don't think of it very often, but it's essentially, it determines the degree of variation and mutation that you can expect to find in the next generation. And this contradiction is important because if you're trying to maximize production and you breed similar to similar for traits, for stable traits, over many generations, you are essentially breeding out the heterozygosity, and you're doing it for a reason, right? You want uniformity, and you want the best traits to manifest themselves across all of the offspring every time you plant them, and they breed. And that facilitates heightened production. It eventually can facilitate standardized practices and techniques of planting and harvesting, right? This is part of the story with corn. It's like you don't just breed in order to have lots of ears of corn on the stalk. One of the big considerations for American agricultural research in the 20th century was breeding corn that would stand up tall and have nice strong stalks and achieve about the same height so that you could then develop tractors and combines and other implements that would match the stature of the corn plants, right? And if you bred a plant that didn't have a stalk strong enough to hold up the weight of all those ears of corn, then if they all started falling down, you had a problem. You had to sort of figure that out too. And in many ways in U.S. agriculture, the implements and the plants have been engineered to fit together with each other, which means that if the crops don't display certain traits, your tractor is less valuable, right? And here again, what you get in the long run is a reduction of the heterozygosity of the seeds themselves. Expanding outward and thinking about larger scales, the variability within a field is another realm of importance. Whether the fields grow the same crop every year, nothing but the same crop, whether you plant multiple crops at the same time or rotate from one crop to another, those are axes of variability that are important to the maintenance of the genetic diversity of the plants themselves. You can think about it in regions. You know, how much variability is there in the different kinds of crops that get planted in the Midwest or in the Central Valley? How much variability is there both between fields and farms and regions, and again, all the way down to the seeds themselves? And you can think about it in regions and internationally. If you have uniformity across the nation with all the farmers who grow a certain crop like corn using the same seeds, you are essentially reducing the variability of corn seed across the entire Middle West, right? And you can think about it internationally. And internationally is the scale that Kloppenberg is most particularly interested in towards the end of his book, because what happens if not only the Midwest, but all of Mexico is also growing the same strains, the same varieties of corn? You have lost a degree of diversity, even if not just because everyone's growing corn, but everyone's growing the same varieties using the same seed. And if you, yes. That's one problem. The question is the main problem with homozygosity the possibility of losing the crop to disease? That's one potentially very important problem, yes. If you have bred for a very narrow genetic basis in the seeds, and a new pest comes along for which that particular strain of, say, corn does not have defenses, you run the risk that the whole crop will be lost, right? And this, in fact, this kind of scare has been known to happen in the United States. It happened in the 70s. It was with corn. I'm forgetting the details right now. But there's another risk as well, and that is losing the alternative varieties that may have the defenses to that pest, and that might serve as a way of addressing the problem of that pest or that disease, right? And this has happened. I mean, there's famous stories about the wine grapes in France, right, which needed the genetic material of wine grape plants from the United States after a major disease outbreak threatened the entire French wine industry. And it turned out that the plants in the United States, which had earlier been brought from Europe, contained genetic material necessary to revive the French wine industry. Now, in the context of commodity competition, you have a risk that the competitive variety, the variety that allows you to achieve the outputs necessary to compete in the market, will drive everyone to grow the same kind of seed and will narrow the basis of the genetic material on which agriculture rests. Precisely because you can't, if you aren't growing that kind of seed, you might not be able to compete in the market and you might go out of business, right? So a lot of this is market mediated and has to do with whether, say, the market for corn is global in the sense that Mexican farmers or farmers elsewhere have to compete with American farmers who are using these new technologies and achieving levels of output that are far, far higher than what's been normal in other parts of the world. Any questions? Yeah. Is the biggest risk the risk of soil depletion? No, I don't. I mean, it's not to say that soil depletion isn't a risk. Soil depletion is a risk, but it's a risk that stands in many ways independent of this. I mean, it depends. There are connections. It wouldn't so much be soil erosion as it might be the simplification of the genetic activities or the diversity of life in the soil itself, right? Soil contains tons and tons and tons of microorganisms, and those organisms also are diverse, and that diversity also is important. And you can alter that diversity by the practices that you use in what you plant there and how you plant it. And in the long run, potentially, that could have a similar kind of contradictory dynamic. But that's not the principal threat that Kloppenberg, I think, is trying to draw our attention to. He's essentially pointing out that world food production, even as it grows bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, is depending increasingly on a narrower and narrower genetic basis. And that raises risks in terms of, very much in terms of issues of disease and pests. The possibility of, what if world corn production suddenly resembled Dalmatians, right? That is a disturbing thought. So one of his main points is that we need diversity of land races. And land races, that term may be unfamiliar to you, land races are major kinds of crops and the varieties of them, right? So we need a diversity of land races adapted to all sorts of conditions and threats. We need heterozygosity within the seeds, and we need a diversity of different varieties of the plants that we depend on. But these may be lost as farmers switch to modern varieties. And so the contradiction sort of comes full circle when you start thinking about the Green Revolution and the sending of improved seed to other parts of the world, frequently the very same parts of the world from which the earlier genetic material was derived. So if we develop a new strain of corn, and it's the competitive one, and we open up Mexican corn production to competition with the US, and we then show up with these seeds and say, well, you want to be able to make a living in farming corn, you better plant this seed. And those farmers stop planting the other kinds of seeds that they have used for millennia. What happens to those other varieties? They may dwindle, disappear. Banking them is a kind of technocratic solution, and it's been done. It's been done ever since the beginning of the Green Revolution, and arguably even earlier. But it's not keeping those plants out on the land, constantly being planted in different places, and adapting over time to the circumstances that they encounter in those different places, right? So we are essentially threatening the very diversity on which continued improvement depends. And this is important. There's no fixed endpoint at which suddenly this is all done. We've engineered the seeds we need, and they're fixed and stable, and we'll never need to worry about them again. There is no endpoint. It's always going to continue because these plants ultimately have to be planted again to reproduce more seed and continue forward, right? And there's always a possibility of some new circumstance arising that proves a weakness, demonstrates a weakness, produces a weakness in the plants that we're using now, and forces us to go back and find some new solution, or some old solution, rather. And we need to be able to continue to draw on the genetic heritage of the plants of the world in order to maintain what we've already got. And the question is, will that heritage still be there? Genetic erosion is a way of describing the loss of that heritage, the loss of that variability and diversity of crop seeds. So, table 7.3 from the book, extent to which small numbers of varieties dominate crop acreage. And these are 1969 figures. So they're quite old at this point, and very likely these numbers have increased. So here are the different crops: beans, cotton, corn, millet, peanut, peas, potato, rice, soybeans, sugar beets, sweet potatoes, wheat. Here are the major varieties, and all that is to say this number of varieties of wheat constitutes this percentage of all the acreage planted to that crop in the world. So 50% of the wheat in 1969 in acreage was planted to just 9 varieties. 69% of sweet potatoes were just 1 variety. 100% of millet was just 3 varieties, that kind of thing. There's a growing dependence on banked germplasm precisely because the diversity of germplasm out there in the fields of the world's farms is declining. Now, are there questions about that before we turn to genetic engineering? Yeah.
So theoretically, at some point, there will be no free seed. Like no free seeds.
Theoretically, at some point, there could be no free seed.
Except, it's not many, because it's controlled by somebody.
Theoretically, we could get to a point in which you can't plant seeds that you haven't bought from somebody. Theoretically. We're not there yet. And it would actually be very difficult to implement such a system, precisely because so many plants still produce seed that's perfectly viable. And if you grow that plant in your garden and harvest those seeds and want to plant them the next year, it's not a given that somebody's going to be able to come around and find you and catch you and force you to buy new seeds instead of planting the ones from last year. What? If they're genetically modified, it would be illegal in many cases, yes. Which is to say, and here again, I mean, this has been in the news in recent years. Farmers, I think there was a farmer in Canada who was prosecuted, planted a seed. Well, there have been different stories, different cases. In some cases, yes, the farmer plants the seed. There's a contract that came with the seed. He had to sign that said, I agree not to plant the seeds from these seeds next year or ever. And there are potentially agents, people from the corporation that sold those seeds, going around trying to check. And if they find out that you've replanted those seeds, they can take you to court. In other cases, I mean, how do you test that? Well, you can run a genetic analysis of the seeds from that next crop and determine whether they were grown from the seeds that you sold this guy a couple years ago. And then you can claim that they were planted on purpose. On the other hand, genetic material can also move around. Pollen can blow from one field to another and cross-pollinate with a crop that was not planted from those seeds and generate that genetic marker and open up a whole can of worms about whether it was actually done on purpose, whether this farmer ever planted these seeds, or whether in fact it's been contaminated by a neighboring crop. And in corn, this is particularly pronounced precisely because of the wind pollination that occurs between corn plants. The controversial research that came out of this university some years ago now, which found that genetic material from genetically engineered corn could now be found in corn long distances away in fields in Mexico planted with native varieties. That was a controversial and potentially enormously important finding, precisely because it highlighted the lack of control that we have over the movement of genetic material, in this case, corn genetic material. There's another question? Yeah.
How far along, or what are the limits of leopard and terminated seeds, or seeds that are engineered after they initially produce?
The terminator gene. It's very far along in some plants, and it's not very far along in others. I'm not up to the very latest date familiar with the details. Nathan, you might know more than I do. The terminator gene is a gene that has been engineered that you can splice into a seed such that the offspring seeds from that seed are sterile and cannot be grown. And that is a kind of enforcement mechanism on this private property claim to the genetic material of the seed. It more or less ensures that it can't be replanted. And that's now widely incorporated into... It's not being marketed at all? Okay, I was under the impression that it was being used at least in some crops, and I can't remember which ones. Yeah. Basmati and turmeric? Monsanto has put that into seeds for those crops in India? Okay. Right. Right. So the rash of suicides among Indian farmers in recent years, which I don't believe is attributable entirely or only to this, but yes, the circumstances of farmers in general are not terribly good, and this does not help, generally speaking. Okay. Do we need a break? What do we got? We got about 9 slides left. We got 25 minutes. Should we just keep going, or should we break? All right, break. Like 3 or 4 minutes?